Yes, finally we are here to the last presentation of the conference. I'm going to tell you a bit about the Swedish longitudinal study as where we are right now, and I'll focus on the epidemiological track of the study. I'll start with a short overview of the study, and then I'll give you some of the new and fresh results. One of the major changes actually to us as public health officers is that our agency was transferred from being an institute into being an agency. So we are not really used to tell where we are from at the moment. But now we are the Public Health Agency of Sweden, and we also have new colleagues working with infectious diseases, which is quite new to us. You will see some similarities between our study and the Victorian gambling study. And that is quite understandable since we have two persons in common. We have Rachel Wahlberg and we have Max Abbott on our advisory board in both studies. And this is a great advantage, I would say, because then we also get easy comparison between the studies. And we will continue to do more comparisons between the studies as time moves on. We are a bit behind, actually. We started at the same time, but they sort of ran before us, and they have now completed their 4 waves, which we have not yet. So, the main objectives for this large longitudinal study was to study changes in incidence and prevalence in Sweden, to describe problem gambling in relation to changes in gambling behavior and gambling-related environmental factors. We wanted to identify relevant target groups for prevention, examine health-related social and economic consequences of problem gambling, and perhaps one of the most important parts, establish risk factors and protective factors of gambling behaviors and habits. And we are doing this by having 3 different tracks of our study. What you see on the top is the epidemiological track with 4 waves of data collection between 2008 and 2014. You have an in-depth track in the middle where we have a subgroup of the informants from the epidemiological track. And they are about 2,000, so it's a large in-depth study. And then we have also a small follow-up track where 500 people were re-interviewed. They participated in a gambling study in 1998-99, and they were followed up while we were doing the first wave of our study. We had a quite our ability to do a random sample is quite different from most jurisdictions because we have Statistics Sweden where we have a lot of population data, and we also have a full register of the entire population which we can relate to a lot of variables. So the sampling was made in different stratas after age, gender, and an assessed risk of problem gambling. So categories that were people who were assessed to have a risk larger than 10% to be a problem gambler were in a special strata. And these were oversampled. So you see we have almost 7,000. Half the sample was from this category. And also we had almost 6,000 people aged between 16 and 24, because young people are also known to be more they are transiting more between different stages of problem gambling, and they are changing a lot more. So this was possible to do since we have so much information in the bottom. But the main cause for this sampling was to get a random sample, so we could use statistical methods to analyze, but also we wanted a sample with as many problem gamblers in as possible. So this was balance between these two different needs. And afterwards, while doing an analysis, we use weights based on quite a lot of variables to then transform this random but stratified sample into something more like the population as it is. And as in Victoria, we had telephone interviews as our primary method, and then we had poster questionnaires as follow-up. And these follow-up questionnaires were really important, I think, because we had quite high proportion of problem gamblers answering in that modus. But the past days I've become quite envious of Rachel, who has turned this. She's actually doing web questionnaires first, then poster questionnaire, and finally tracking people with telephone. I think that's quite clever. I would have loved to do that as well. Maybe for some other study. But still, I think even though it of course causes some problems, which actually Chris talk partly covered, if you have different modes of collecting data, you also have effect on what answers you get. So still there is a problem having these different ways of collecting data, but I still think it's important to do it and try to get as much information out from those you intended to ask your questions to. The questionnaires covered basically 4 different areas: gambling, gambling problems, computer gaming, and health, demographics and socio-economy. The last part of this here, demographics, socio-economy, a lot of that information we did not ask about. We collected them from registers, and we asked the participants if this was okay to do, and then we could use the interview time to more gambling-related questions. And this is a schedule of when and where we did the assessments in this track. So you see, we had the baseline, the EP1, where we had quite a lot about gambling participation. We also asked about the history at this time. We had 3 different problem gambling instruments. You know about the SOGs and you know about the PGSI. Fourth is actually a Swedish short instrument, which we wanted to try against these more well-known instruments. And we also asked about other gambling-related issues, such as thoughts about gambling and other things like that. The EP2 was a shorter questionnaire. It was made 1 year after the EP1, and it was mainly focused on data for incidence estimates. And then we had EP3, when we also added quite a lot more on social issues, because we want more information that's not the life around the gambler, not only gambling-related questions. We have tried to analyze that data a bit now after the 3rd wave, but we cannot see so much significance from that actually. But I think also after wave 4, these data can be more important to analyze. I had this, being a statistician, of course I love tables. I think they are so nice. This is in color. And I think this really is important, because this is now again the scheme from our sampling strategy. So you have age, you have gender, and you have this assessed risk of problem gambling. And then you have the overall response rate. How many of those left in the 3rd wave from those 15,000 sampled in the beginning? So we have 28% of the 15,000. We lost almost half in the first wave, and then we have lost more. But what is important is that we actually kept quite high proportions of the nice middle-aged people here, especially women, so who mostly delivers and stays on in the study. So if you undersample these categories, you still get quite a lot of information because they are more probable to stay in the study. And then the yellow colors show where we have participant response rates above the average. And you see they stretch out, not entirely in the way that I would have guessed, because we still have quite high participation rates here among the young people. And young people are known to not stay in studies. And particularly here, we have the male, young males from the categories where we expect problem gamblers, and they have stayed on as the average of the study. I think that's quite extraordinary. One section where we actually miss information, I would say, is down here. So the females, which might be in the problem category, they were not so many to begin with, and we have lost most of them. So that's the weak side of this study, I would say, that we could not keep them in the study once we had got them. Yeah. So this is a chart showing those that we actually got in the first wave, which were about 8,100 persons. Half of them, almost, stayed on until the third wave. Then we had about a quarter in wave 1 and wave 2. And we have a small proportion returning, actually. We lost them in wave 2, we got them back in wave 3. And then finally we have 23% that we lost after wave 1. And what I'm going to show you now is results from this. No, sorry. Oh, this is dangerous. There. This section. The results I'm going to show now are from these participating in all 3 waves. And what I did was, I looked at transitions such as Chris's, no, it was Rosa's graph. Yes. Yeah, Rosa had the graph in a previous seminar today showing the transitions. So if you start as a non-problem gambler, you can change into some different ways. And if you have 3 waves, and you look at either being a non-problem gambler, which is based on the PGSI. So if you have not more than 2, so if you are low risk or if you are a non-problem gambler, then you are a minus in this table. And if you have 3 or more on the PGSI, moderate risk or problem gambler, then you are a plus. So we can have people staying, the green people here staying on, no problem. They are 95% in the sample, and if we also weight the data to fit more into what the population is like, it's about 96%. And then we have these starting having no problems, continuing having no problems, entering problems, a small proportion, about 1%, and so on and so forth. And what is really interesting, I think, in this table is that we would say, on our website we do say, that the proportion of the Swedish population having gambling problems defined as 3+ are about 2%. But that's only a snapshot of the reality. So now when we have followed people over from 2008 to 2012, approximately 4 years, we have around 4% being affected one time and another. And I think that's an important lesson to learn from longitudinal studies. How large portion of your population actually is at some time or the other into problems like this. We could also conclude that 16% never gambled over these 4 years. So when we follow them. So we do say about 70% of the population do gamble, but it's really depending on how you measure. It's probably a bit higher. So 1 year you might gamble, the other one you might not. So I think we have a lot to learn. So now I try to color code them, as you might have figured out. Those that are green are sort of no problem, and they are even white in the right hand of the table. You also have a white category here, those that had problem in wave 1, but then left the problem status. They are seemingly all right now. And if we look at gender and age of these categories, you see that we have almost equal proportions of males and females being in the green category. We have high proportion of males here. Those entering problems somehow later in the study. And we have a high proportion over here of the problem gamblers that leaves the final round so far. They were problem gamblers in wave 1 and 2, but then they left. And we have a low proportion of males in this category. People going in and out of problems. They seem to be more female. We don't really know so much more about that yet. We can see it's a fact, but what it means we don't know. And when we look at age, so the average age in the total study is around 37, and the highest average is here for those gambling or even not gambling through the study. But what is interesting, I think, is the category with the lowest age here. These are young. They are no problem gamblers in the first wave, but then they get into problem and they stay in this category also in the third wave. And they are young, they are aged between 17 and 32 in wave 1. So these are young people. And this is a bit scary, I think, if they get into problem and seem to stay there. So this is a category we are, of course, know a bit about already, but I think it's necessary to keep it in mind that they actually exist like this. So, if we want to know more about these categories, I have done analysis for a split the category. So I looked at this left-hand category, people that were not in problem in wave 1, and where did they go, what matters. And then we saw significant impact from having had previous gambling problems, from playing video or computer games in wave 1, having bad mental health, smoking and alcohol use. These affected the probability to not stay a non-problem gambler. And on the right-hand side, you have the opposite. I analyzed from having a problem to start with here and staying on. This is sort of the base category, and what would make people move out. And it's the same, more or less the same factors, but we don't get so strong results because it's a small group. So I can't really tell if the video and computer gaming, tobacco and alcohol use is because the sample is not big enough, or maybe it is because this category already uses it, so they are higher. But what I'm showing in the graph is the proportions now. So it's not the final results from the analysis. What is interesting when I did this analysis is that I controlled for age and gender. And age was always significant, but gender was not. So when I controlled for gender, it just disappeared as an explanatory factor. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And for those of you not so very keen on tables, I also have a nice graph. And you see, the red line, I think, is so important. That's the proportion of people having previous gambling problems in wave 1 when it started. And you see it's quite dramatic. It's a quite dramatic change over the different categories. And my conclusion from that is it's important to have a gambling industry that does not make people get into problems, because once these problems appear, it's always a risk factor, a staying on risk factor. We also looked a bit on life events. And the two life events that seemed important were divorce or separation and having more arguments with someone close, which sort of relates to each other. So I would say the divorce or separation is probably could be a reason for both here. And we see it's a bit more complicated to try to figure out what does this mean, because we have here 0 here for these going into problems. But I think this 0 is probably because these are young people. They were between 17 and 30. So many of them are not really into a relation still. They are maybe separating from the parents or doing some kind of smaller revolution against the family, but still they are different. But for instance, those staying constantly in the problem gambling category, a high proportion of these also have separation from time point 1 to time point 2. So there's a graph of that as well. And you see this more argument. It's more clear here. We have this young category. They are really high up on that one, even though they didn't divorce someone. So what we are moving on to now, or what we actually are doing all the time, is that we want to keep focus to our overarching goal for this study. What we are doing, we are doing this project within a public health agency, and the ultimate goal is to develop knowledge to be used to develop methods and strategies for prevention of gambling problems. We keep reminding us of that. This is what we actually are doing. And we also have this perspective that we know there are a lot of persons here, but we also have a lot of things out here, the community, the culture. And we try to bring in knowledge about this complexity when analyzing our results. So we are now planning for the 4th wave of data collection, which will be undertaken this autumn. And after that, I look forward to do a lot of number crunching, analyzing, comparing with Chris's results. And we hope to be able to bring more knowledge into the gambling research field as we do this. Thank you.